Unit 731. In the 1930s and 40s, Japan operated a secret facility in Manchuria, disguised as a water purification unit. It was nothing of the sort. Inside, doctors and scientists ran one of the most extensive human experimentation programs in history, on thousands of prisoners, most of them Chinese civilians and captured soldiers. What made this different from ordinary wartime atrocity was the clinical precision behind it. Subjects were infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax to study how diseases spread through the human body. Others were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes were forced from their sockets. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, so researchers could observe organs functioning in real time. Limbs were frozen solid, then thawed, to study frostbite and gangrene progression. The facility's own staff referred to their subjects not by name, but as logs, as if the site were simply processing timber. After Japan's surrender, the United States made a decision that still troubles historians today. Rather than prosecute the scientists responsible, American officials granted them immunity in exchange for the data they had collected. That data on biological warfare, pathogen behavior, and human tissue response, gathered through years of torture, was quietly absorbed into American military research. Not one senior member of Unit 731 stood trial at the Tokyo tribunals. The Tuskegee study. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service launched a study in Macon County, Alabama, that would run for exactly 40 years. The subjects were 399 black men already infected with syphilis. They were never told they had the disease. Instead, researchers described their condition only as bad blood and offered free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance to keep them participating. The actual goal of the study was to observe, untreated, exactly how syphilis destroys the human body over a lifetime. By the mid-1940s, penicillin had become the standard, effective cure for syphilis, cheap and widely available. The men were never given it. Researchers actively worked to prevent them from receiving treatment elsewhere, coordinating with local doctors and draft boards to keep the men out of any program that might cure them. As the decades passed, the men suffered blindness, heart disease, and dementia caused directly by the untreated infection. Many died. Some passed the disease to their wives, and several children were born with congenital syphilis as a result. It was not government oversight that ended the study. It was a leak to the press in 1972 by a whistleblower inside the Public Health Service. Public outrage forced its shutdown 4 decades after it began. MKUltra. Starting in 1953, the CIA launched a program aimed at a single unsettling goal: figuring out whether the human mind could be controlled. Over the next 2 decades, the agency funded more than 150 sub-projects across dozens of universities, hospitals, and prisons, most of the time without informing the people running them what the money was actually for. The experiments themselves ranged from disturbing to bizarre. Subjects, many of them unaware they were part of any experiment at all, were dosed with LSD in real-world settings, sometimes slipped into their food or drinks without consent. One CIA operation, run out of a fake brothel in San Francisco, dosed unwitting clients with hallucinogens while agents watched through one-way glass. Other experiments used sensory deprivation, electroshock, and prolonged sleep deprivation, attempting to erase a subject's existing personality entirely and rebuild it from nothing. At McGill University in Canada, psychiatric patients seeking help for anxiety and depression were instead subjected to weeks of induced comas and repeated electroshock, while tape loops played the same phrases into their ears thousands of times. Many never recovered their original memories or personalities. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal unfolded, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered nearly all MKUltra documents destroyed. What survived only came to light in 1977, after a set of financial records was found that had been misfiled and missed the shredding order. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In August 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set up a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University's psychology building. He recruited 24 college students, screened as healthy and well-adjusted, and randomly assigned half to be guards and half to be prisoners. The study was supposed to run 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. What Zimbardo documented was how quickly ordinary people slid into cruelty once given a uniform and unchecked authority. Guards, with no formal instruction beyond keeping order, escalated within 24 hours to psychological humiliation. Prisoners were stripped, forced to do degrading exercises, and denied bathroom access as punishment, made to relieve themselves in buckets left in their cells. One guard, later nicknamed by participants after a character in A Clockwork Orange, became notably inventive with punishment, and prisoners began showing real signs of breakdown. One had to be released after 36 hours, suffering an acute psychological crisis. Zimbardo himself, acting as the prison superintendent, later admitted he became so absorbed in the role that he failed to intervene until his girlfriend, visiting the basement, saw what was happening and told him he needed to stop it. The experiment has since faced serious criticism for coaching and methodology, but it remains one of the most cited studies in psychology on how quickly authority corrupts behavior. The Milgram Experiment. In 1961, just months after the trial of Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann began, psychologist Stanley Milgram at Yale wanted to answer one question. Could ordinary Americans be talked into inflicting serious harm on another person simply because an authority figure told them to? Volunteers were told they were participating in a study on memory and learning. They were instructed to administer increasingly powerful electric shocks to another participant seated in a separate room every time that person answered a question incorrectly. In reality, the shocks were fake, and the other participant was an actor. But the volunteers didn't know that. As the actor screamed in pain, begged to stop, and eventually fell silent, over 60% of volunteers continued administering shocks all the way to the maximum setting, labeled clearly on the machine as a lethal 450 volts, simply because a man in a lab coat standing beside them calmly said, "The experiment requires that you continue." Many volunteers showed visible distress, sweating, trembling, and nervous laughter, yet kept pressing the switch anyway. Milgram's results shocked the psychological community and the public alike. It suggested that under the right conditions, the capacity to inflict serious harm on a stranger existed in the vast majority of ordinary people, not just in the historically unique monsters everyone assumed had committed the Holocaust. The Monster Study. In 1939 at the University of Iowa, speech pathologist Wendell Johnson wanted to test a theory about the origins of stuttering. He selected 22 orphan children from a state home in Davenport, Iowa, roughly half of whom stuttered and half of whom spoke normally. What followed became one of the most ethically condemned experiments in the history of psychology. The children who spoke normally were subjected to constant, harsh, negative feedback about their speech, told repeatedly that they were beginning to stutter and needed to correct it immediately, even though nothing was actually wrong with how they spoke. Researchers scolded them for every hesitation and mispronunciation, real or invented. The goal was to see whether psychological pressure alone could induce a stutter in a child with no speech impediment. It worked, but not in the way researchers hoped to publish. Several of the children developed lasting speech anxiety, self-consciousness, and in some cases genuine stutters that persisted into adulthood, along with long-term psychological damage from the sustained belittling. Johnson never published the results, reportedly because even he understood how the study would be received. It remained buried until a journalist uncovered it decades later, in 2001. The University of Iowa formally apologized in 2007, and the state of Iowa eventually paid a settlement to the surviving subjects, then in their 70s. Guatemala syphilis experiments. Between 1946 and 1948, years before Tuskegee was even exposed, American researchers working with the Guatemalan government ran a parallel and in some ways more aggressive program. Rather than simply observing untreated syphilis, researchers deliberately infected people with it. The subjects included soldiers, prisoners, and patients in a psychiatric hospital, none of whom gave informed consent. Researchers infected them using prostitutes paid to have sex with the subjects while carrying the disease. And when that method proved inconsistent, doctors switched to directly inoculating subjects by cutting their skin and applying infectious material straight into the wound. Roughly 1,300 people were deliberately infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, or chancroid. Fewer than half ever received treatment afterward. The program was led by an American doctor who had also worked on Tuskegee, and it remained essentially unknown to the public for over 60 years. It only came to light in 2010, when a medical historian combing through old archived papers stumbled onto the doctor's personal notes describing the program in detail. President Obama formally apologized to Guatemala's president once the findings became public, calling the experiments a reprehensible chapter in medical research history. Project 4.1. In March 1954, the United States detonated a hydrogen bomb codenamed Castle Bravo on Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. The blast was roughly 1,000 times more powerful than expected, and radioactive fallout spread far beyond the planned zone, blanketing the nearby inhabited island of Rongelap in white ash within hours. The residents, unaware of what it was, reportedly played in it and let it fall on their skin. Rather than immediately evacuating the islanders, American officials waited 2 full days before removing them. What followed became known internally as Project 4.1, framed publicly as a humanitarian medical response, but functioning, according to later declassified documents, largely as a long-term study of radiation exposure on human beings in real-world conditions no laboratory could ethically replicate. For decades afterward, American doctors returned to the islands regularly to conduct examinations, drawing blood, photographing thyroid tumors, and tracking developmental abnormalities in children born to exposed parents, all while providing minimal actual treatment for the radiation sickness, cancers, and birth defects the exposure caused. Many islanders were only allowed to return home in 1957 into an environment still contaminated with radioactive material. Declassified government memos later confirmed officials understood at the time that the islands were a rare opportunity to study fallout effects on humans and treated the population accordingly.